All black, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Kelly Nicole Gross, the National Endowment for the Humanities professor and chair of African American Studies at Emory University. She's the author of Colored Amazons, Crime, Violence, and Black Women in the City of Brotherly Love, 1880 to 1910, published by Duke University Press. Hannah Marie Tabbs and the Disembodied Torso, A Tale of Race, Sex, and Violence in America, published by Oxford University Press, 2018. She's a co-editor with Dana Ramey Berry of A Black Woman's History of the United States, published in 2020 by Beacon Press. And she joins us today to talk about her new book, Vengeance, Feminism, The Power of Black Women's Fury in Lawless Times, published by Seal Press. It is the 2025 Asala Book Prize winner for Best New Book in African American History. Of Vengeance Feminism, our friend Erica Armstrong Dunbar writes, with captivating prose that centers nail-biting struggle, Vengeance Feminism offers both a practical and theoretical new pillar of Black feminism. Kelly Nicole Gross uses the nation's birthplace of Philadelphia as an apt symbolic stage for the violent, clever, and dramatic ways that Black women protected and defended themselves when justice was unavailable. This book is a powerful and important contribution to 19th century Black women's history. How are you doing today, Professor Gross?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. And so I want to start by asking you how you got to this book. And there is this connective tissue between this book and your earlier work. Namely, what is it about you and the city of Philadelphia?
I know. I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised, but I'm about to be banished from my home state because of my affinity for the city of brotherly love. Philadelphia is an important city in African American and American history. Many of the sort of ills that plagued the nation were present in Philadelphia. So it had enslavement, even as it had like folks who were committed to Quaker values and brotherly love. At the same time, it also, though, did have a movement to eventually and gradually abolish enslavement. So it also gave way to one of the largest Black free populations prior to the end of the Civil War. It also is kind of the birthplace of the penitentiary system in the U.S., as well as it's the birthplace for the nation. So it has its place in these kind of interesting intersections for American history and specifically African American history. So for that and many other reasons, all of these Black institutions that were formed in Philadelphia, the AME Church, the Philadelphia Tribune, the longest running independent Black newspaper. I could go on, but it's an important site, and I found it really generative for the kind of work that I do.
You might try to hide it, but I still hear New York.
You hear when I say New York and when I say coffee.
There are, as you write about and fully understand, right, there's so many different strains of Black feminist thought. But there always has been, particularly I would argue in the main line of feminist thought, a way to try to balance Black feminist critique with a kind of Black respectability, so that critique would be meaningful in these mainstream Black institutions. You kind of throw that baby out with the bathwater, right? That this is not a book about Black respectability. This is not a book that's trying to translate Black feminism into some sort of guise of Black respectability. It's vengeance feminism. Talk a little bit about that title and what exactly you mean by that.
Thank you for this question. This is a good one. It's a tough one for me to try to answer in a way that's going to be coherent and concise. I don't want to put your viewers to sleep. The book was born from a lot of different places, but it probably crystallized. Some of it is from my background, my mother's own experiences, and we can probably talk more about that as we go on, as well as the moment, around the centennial for the 19th Amendment, there was all this conversation around suffrage. And I had been involved in a series of panels and symposia on kind of Black feminism, but also what other kinds of with Black women, what were they doing if they weren't suffragists? What were their politics? What were they engaged in? And, the bulk of my work is on Black women who have in some way experienced the criminal justice system in the United States. And I wonder, well, if they have a feminist politics, what was it and what did it look like? And when I look back at the patterns in their crime, I realized they did, but it was very different than the ways that we think about mainstream feminism. It was a politics that they enacted on the ground. It was about lashing back and finding a way to grant themselves a measure of justice or to avenge themselves against racist and misogynistic wrongs in spaces where it would probably not be acknowledged in any way.
You make a distinction between vengeance and rage. And in that distinction, vengeance sounds much more intentional, much more generative from a kind of control and folks being deliberate, just as opposed to just lashing out in anger.
I do think so. And I try to use words like fury also because it's kind of this is anger that's also concerned with justice.
Yeah.
And I think that vengeance is very much in a similar vein. It is, but I also make it clear that it's not an eye for an eye, that their social position in society isn't going to allow them to do that. They're not powerful enough in a bunch of different ways to hit those registers. It's a finger for an eye. Right? So you're going to hurt, you'll get cut, you will bleed, but it's not going to be exactly in kind.
I'm always struck by historians, particularly Black women historians, who delve deeply into the archive of Black women and deal specifically with the violence that is directed towards Black women. We're expected on some level as scholars to be kind of dispassionate, right, and objective about this. No scholar is, right? We just like to pretend that that's the case. But for you, how did you manage yourself intellectually, emotionally, psychically, dealing with the specifics of this archive and the violence that's directed towards these women throughout the book?
Thank you. It was a hard book to write. There's no question about that. There were some chapters where I literally cried writing it, but there were other stories that actually kind of rescued me. I was as violent and as graphic as many of the cases are. I was really struck. I just took heart in the fact that we finally have that counts of women who weren't just constantly buffeted around helplessly by the savagery of the systems. That there were Black women who decided that they weren't going to be killed by batterers, that they weren't just going to suffer dishonor, that they weren't going to, be forced to carry or bear children that they didn't want. That on some level, they understood the nature of the world against them, the injustices, and the ways that it was corrupt and hollowed out, and decided that they were going to put their own needs and desires first, kind of by any means necessary. So as difficult as it was to write, there's something about that I personally took comfort in, just to sort of beat back the kind of gnawing, the vicissitudes sometimes about Black womanhood in America.
You're writing about the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I was struck, particularly in that opening chapter, about Black women who felt the need to defend their own honor at a time when society clearly wasn't defending their honor. And to the extent that Black men defended the honor of Black women, it was always in the context of a patriarchy, right? And what those women meant and how they were valued within the context of that patriarchy. If they weren't to be valued by that patriarchy, they weren't going to be defended. and you choose women, who complicate our sense of this. Women who go to church, but at the same time are drinking and having a lot of sex, right? Women who knew how to publicly carry themselves with a certain kind of sense of respectability. So much so, right? As you write about in that first case, all this other stuff can go down, but once you call me a name that is unacceptable for me to be called in public, then I got to shoot you. So talk a little bit about this idea of Black women defending their honor.
You hit it beautifully for me. I don't know what more I can add. Yeah, I really appreciated the fact that these are not the usual customers, right? That we see real evidence of women who are hanging out in juke joints and parlors and engaging in all manner of illicit activity that you would think would mean that they don't necessarily care about their womanhood or expect a measure of respect.
Right.
And what we learn really quickly is that is not the case, that they have a precise understanding of how they define honor. And once someone crossed the line, they were more than ready to defend it. And what I love about them in that moment is that it's almost a comment, too, on the ways that there are still states at this time where white men could legally avenge dishonor through duels and all the rest. So you think about Black women as population that's routinely, derided, face every manner of degradation and demoralization, expected to always just soldier on, to have a group of women, because it's more than one, who decides, I can put up with a lot, but once you've crossed my line, like I will demand satisfaction. And I'm prepared to pay the price for whatever comes with that. But they went into that with clear intention.
It's interesting, right? Because again, you're writing about the late 19th and 20th, early 20th century. And I'm reading these stories and immediately I'm thinking about the image I see in my head is Megan Thee Stallion, right? And a generation, particularly in the situation that she dealt with, being shot in the foot. How these stories represent a through line in terms of the experiences of Black women, that even if the times have changed, even if Black people and more generally Black women have some semblance of more freedom, there still are these questions about who's going to defend our honor if I don't defend my honor, right? Whether that's in the judicial context or in other ways, on my own.
Absolutely. And I think the other piece for me that's important, that these women are not cowed by the trope of them being angry and standing up for themselves, right? They're loosed from that. That's not their issue. So that was also comforting for me to see too. And I think a lot of times, especially with a case like Megan Thee Stallion, there are these tensions around what she's supposed to also suffer in order to protect Black men and like the Black community, right? So you got shot in the foot, but like maybe you shouldn't turn this brother over to the justice system, and the struggle that she goes through with that.
Talking about these through lines again, because this is, these are dynamics that are present in your earlier work. For you as an intellectual, as a scholar, as a historian, why was it so important to tell these women's stories, right? I mean, there's so many stories in the archive. And, in the way that you even just described it, right? These women align with certain kinds of stereotypes that Black men have of Black women, angry Black women, quote unquote, the angry Black women. Some of the stereotypes that gets embedded in judicial practices and law enforcement practices in terms of how the larger society thinks about Black women and their capacity of rage and violence within that context. Why was it so important for you to embrace and talk about these women?
It's important for a couple of reasons. First, I think we need to be telling all of our stories, period, full stop. Good, bad, mad, glad, or sad. I don't think anybody is below historical treatment. We should look at that and think critically about it. And for Black women who are not in these lanes of respectability is even more important because we need to see the masses of Black women's experiences. And even though many of the cases in my book are extreme, a lot of the women who are involved in them, their lives, their socioeconomic status, the circumstances surrounding them are very much in line with the masses of everyday Black women in the city. Mm-hmm. So their stories become critically important. And I think finally, the other piece that's super important about looking at this constellation of women in particular is because they managed to do some extraordinary things in spite of where they're at and the bold stances that they take. They find ways to leverage the insults and their sort of seeming powerlessness. They manage to leverage their position in ways that bring out different kinds of victories for themselves, whether that's incredibly reduced sentences, whether it's getting released outright.
Right.
I mean, some of it's just who would have thunk it? Look at some of the cases, I'm fully expecting them to go down, and they end up walking out. So they've learned a lot too about the loopholes in the system and how to exploit them from the position they're in. And that for me is really powerful. And even when they do serve time, like the case of one of the women who shot, the brother who done her wrong and dishonored her and all this stuff, even in that case, she actually managed to get mainstream society talking about Black women having virtue.
Right.
A virtue that was worthy of being defended. So they accomplished some extraordinary things from some unlikely places.
If there was a figure in the book that you would describe as the shero of the book, who is it?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I know because there are a bunch of sheros.
Yeah, they really are. Who's my? I think I like Mary Wright. I like Mary Wright for this because when I first stumbled across her case, it was a turn of the century case, young Black woman looks like she's going down for murder of her white employer, an elderly white woman who was very wealthy and from an elite Philadelphian family. So at the outset, it just doesn't look good for Mary at all. Mary looks like she's going to take a massive fall. And things, Mary starts to weaponize that housekeeper knowledge. She knows when to speak, when not to. Even though she liked to hang out in cabaret and drink and party on the shore, she also was an active member in her church, so they come through for her. I mean, she just manages to, and even when the odds were really stacked against her, I recently gave a talk about her case, and one of the things I can't show it here, is actually show the difference in the physical file, because there's a point where she implicates her employer's son, a younger white man. And if you could see the difference in the size of the indictment against him, it's like one thin little paper versus like the stack of papers for her indictment, you get this visual of just how tilted these scales actually are. So the fact that she manages to pull out a victory just blows my mind. Yeah. She's my shero.
Was there a story that you came across that for whatever reasons you could not include in the book that you wish you would have been able to?
That's a good one. No, I pretty much, I'm one of these, I'll make $1 out of that 15 cent. So I found every case, if there was any kind of way to work it in, I tried to do so because I wanted to use every aspect of the evidence to try to tell a story and tell it in a way where people wouldn't just read it on the page, but really maybe kind of feel it a little, like get a fuller sense of the experience of the time and of what they were up against.
You end the book remembering your mother who died in 2017.
Yes.
And the story she shared with you about having to draw the line in her own first marriage. Talk about how influential your mother was, obviously to you and who you've become, but in telling this story.
Oh, definitely. I mean, my mother, now that's my shero right there. And, I miss every day. God bless her. Yesterday was her birthday. And so my mom really took pains to talk to me about Black womanhood. So she talked to me about having an illegal abortion as a teenager, about the trauma, the fear, the pain, the difficulty, because she wanted me to know about this so I could avoid these things. So we talked a lot about sex, birth control, all of it. She also talked to me a lot about her first marriage, someone who initially she loved, but he became physically abusive. And she had just reached her limit with it. And one day after he slapped her, she pulled a knife on him and just told him point blank, if you hit me again, I'll go to jail tonight. And to this day, I'm actually thankful that he took her at her word. So however she said it, whatever that countenance was like, he knew
I need to be out.
It was for real. And he was like 6'6". I mean, he was a large man. So I'm glad to this day that he heeded that and he left and they got a quickie divorce. But she used that story to tell me, don't fall in love with anyone so much that you cannot leave. And if any man becomes any partner, I'll just round it out. Any partner becomes abusive with you, do not accept that. The first hit is never the last.
Yeah.
And those lessons have always stayed with me. And I've always been in awe. You can tell this in my book. I adore all manner of unruly Black women. I'm women, I just do. Many of the women in my families are fighters, literally and figuratively. And I admire them. But I mean, also, in awe of it, because as I was thinking back on those experiences and the teaching that my mother gave me and looking at these cases in the 19th century, I mean, I was struck by the through line there. How many of those women, what my mother confronted in the 20th century was very similar to what Black women in the 19th were dealing with. You're either going to be abused by this man and potentially could lose your life, or stand up for yourself and risk really being abused by the state.
Right.
Because you might go to jail. They don't believe you have in self-defense for you. So that kind of through line, it really struck me. And it's been instructive, certainly for this book. But really, when I think back on all of my books, those teachings, those lessons are there.
I want to switch gears just a little bit. We are both chairs of Black Studies departments in this unique moment. How are you processing the role, right? And I don't want to talk so much about the attacks towards Black Studies because however that's played out in the media, it's not brand new for anyone who does Black Studies, right?
Right.
But how are you in processing the importance of Black Studies in this moment?
This is a good question. And I think it's layered. First of all, we need this history in our studies now, especially so that we understand how to get through, because we've been at points like this before. So the research that we do, the writing, all of it. And it's not just protest and lawsuits, all aspects, the literature, the music, the arts, all of these things become key for how we get through and continue going forward. So those are some of the ways that I'm processing it. Definitely in the classroom with students. The other piece is also, there is a part of me that worries or wonders, if we really are at that point where we all we got. Yeah. So I'm definitely wrestling with that and the implications of that. And if that's the case, what steps do we need to take to make sure that we are bulletproof on one hand, but also giving ourselves still space to be humans, to not have to be 100% perfect. I think in this moment, there's so much surveillance. We know these attacks are coming. There's a way that on one hand, you want to try to cover every base, right? And I get the wisdom of that, but then the other part of me is frustrated by that too, because we are human beings. We are an academic department like many others, right? Point one of them to me that is perfect and without flaw.
Right.
Then maybe come for us.
Right.
So those are some of the early ways that I'm processing it. But in the meantime, I'm also thinking about ways that we need to be audacious, right? That, I think about, I've just taught this, so it's like fresh in my mind, so at the height of like lynching and, the Red Summer and all these things going on in the U.S., you also have this explosion of like the Harlem Renaissance, right? Where people are writing, getting publishing contracts, sculpting, making music, art, living. You have Black queer life expanding, all of these things right up against some of the most repressive, violent regimes possible. So I'm also thinking about what are the ways that we become audacious too. So how we resist on many levels.
I think
we need all of it right now.
It's a reminder, particularly the example that you just gave of the Harlem Renaissance period. Part of these attacks are about keeping us from doing the work. Right. So, at a base level, right, we have to continue to do the work, right? Because that's the thing that put us in the bullseye in the first place.
Do the work, celebrate the work, and stop acting like the work isn't important.
Right.
Because if it wasn't a threat, they wouldn't be this hell bent on trying to shut it down.
Or there's some distinction between the academic and the scholarly work and the political work. Right. There's always been this relationship between the two. I mean, Black studies as we know it growing up in the 1960s, right, was fueled by a political movement. Right. So we need to kind of remember some of those relationships as we go forward now.
I didn't grow up in the 60s, Mark. I'm sorry.
I didn't either. but you get my point. We've all read about the 60s.
That's right.
Glad that you could have a sense of humor in the midst of all of this.
I have to. I try to laugh every single day. There's plenty of cussing too, because I wouldn't be a native New Yorker without that. But I do try to laugh every single day.
We've been joined today by Professor Nicole Gross, the National Endowment for the Humanities professor and chair of African American Studies at Emory University. She joined us today to talk about her new book, Vengeance Feminism, The Power of Black Women's Fury in Lawless Times, both a study of the history, but in many ways, perhaps a blueprint for our futures. Thank you very much for joining us today, Callie.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.